Christmas looks peaceful today, but history turned it into the weirdest holiday on the planet. From monster cats judging your outfits to talking animals, prophetic onions, goblin invasions, and rituals that make zero sense now, people once followed Christmas rules that feel absolutely unhinged. So let's go through 44 real historical beliefs that prove the holiday used to be way stranger and way funnier than anyone expects. 1. Catalonia has arguably the most insane tradition on Earth involving a character called the Tio de Nadal, or the pooping log. Families would bring a hollow log into the living room, paint a smiley face on it, and spend weeks feeding it nuts and fruits like a wooden pet. On Christmas Eve, the children were instructed to beat the poor log violently with sticks, while singing a specific song demanding that it empty its bowels immediately. The belief was that if you hit the wood hard enough, it would literally poop out presents and candy for the family to enjoy. It is a bizarre holiday miracle that teaches kids that extreme violence and healthy digestion go hand in hand. 2. If you think Christmas carolers are annoying, wait until you hear about the Welsh tradition called Mari Lwyd. This involved a group of people arriving at your door carrying a real horse skull mounted on a pole and draped in a white sheet like a zombie pony. The terrifying part is that the undead horse would challenge the homeowner to a battle of rhymes and insults right on the doorstep. If the dead horse won the rap battle, you had to let the group inside and give them all your food and beer. It is honestly the most aggressive way to get a free drink in history and makes modern begging look polite. 3. Being born on Christmas Day sounds like you won the lottery, but old German folklore decided to ruin the party for everyone. The people back then believed that a baby born on December 25th was actually being rude by trying to steal attention from the holiday itself. The punishment for this accidental scheduling conflict was that the child was destined to turn into a werewolf later in life. Imagine looking at a cute newborn baby and genuinely worrying that he is going to grow a tail and howl at the moon just because he arrived a few days late. It is probably the most ridiculous reason to ground your kid in history. 4. Iceland came up with the most aggressive fashion critic in history, known as the Yule Cat. This was not a cute kitten, but a giant monster that roamed the snow looking for people who had terrible outfits. The rule was simple and completely bizarre because you had to receive at least one new piece of clothing for Christmas, or the cat would take you away and eat you. It sounds like a lie parents told their kids to make them appreciate a pair of wool socks instead of toys. Imagine getting devoured by a giant feline just because you decided to wear last year's sweater to the office party. 5. In Greece, people feared nasty goblins called kalakanseroi, who came out of the earth to cause trouble during the holidays. The absurd part is that the ultimate weapon against these monsters was a simple kitchen colander left on the doorstep. The legend says these goblins are obsessed with counting holes, but they are practically brain-dead and cannot count past the number 2. They would sit on the porch trying to count the holes in the strainer all night until the sun came up and they had to flee. You literally defeated a demonic invasion from the underworld with a cheap piece of spaghetti equipment. 6. You would think talking animals would be the main event of the holiday season, but European farmers made it weirdly complicated. The legend said that at exactly midnight on Christmas Eve, every cow and chicken in the barn suddenly had a full conversation in human language. Instead of selling tickets to this miracle, farmers were terrified because the rules said listening to the chat was strictly forbidden. People genuinely believed that if you heard a sheep say hello, you would be struck down by a mysterious force immediately. So you had grown men hiding under their blankets sweating nervously just because they thought their donkey might be outside telling jokes. 7. Families today argue over board games, but in the past they played a game called Let Us See Who Disappears Next Year. They would light the massive Yule log and stare obsessively at the shadows it cast on the wall to check for bad omens. The belief was that if the firelight made your shadow look like it was missing a head, you were not going to make it to the next Christmas dinner. It turned a cozy night by the fire into a high-pressure posture contest where everyone sat stiff as a board. You can bet nobody wanted to be the guy whose shadow looked a little bit shorter than usual that night. 8. We worry about getting coal in our stockings, but kids in the Alps had to deal with a witch named Frau Perchta, who took cleaning way too seriously. She would wander around during the holidays inspecting homes to see if the servants had finished their spinning and swept the floors. If you were lazy, she would supposedly empty you out and stuff you with straw and pebbles like a scarecrow. It is definitely one way to motivate people to do their chores, but it seems like a bit of an overreaction for a dusty living room. She was basically the worst house guest you could ever invite over. 9. In England, eating mince pies was not just a snack choice, it was literally a supernatural contract with the universe. The rule was that you had to eat one pie every single day for the 12 days of Christmas to ensure luck for the coming year. It sounds like the perfect excuse to ignore a diet because you could look your family in the eye and say, you were only eating this fourth pastry to protect everyone from misfortune in April. Basically, if you refused a snack, you were dooming yourself to a terrible year. So stuffing your face was practically a public service to your community. 10. Catalonia returns to the list with arguably the most disrespectful decoration in religious history called the Caganer. While most people set up a nativity scene with Mary Joseph and the baby Jesus, the Catalans decided to add a figurine of a peasant, pulling his pants down and pooping in the corner. The belief is that his deposit fertilizes the ground and brings abundance for the coming year, but it looks completely insane. It is hard to focus on the miracle of birth when there is a ceramic guy answering the call of nature right next to the wise men and the angels. 11. We think of Santa as a solo act, but in Austria, he traveled with a terrifying sidekick named Krampus, who had zero holiday spirit. While Santa was busy handing out candy, this guy was responsible for chasing naughty kids around with a bundle of sticks. It was the ultimate good cop, bad cop routine where one guy gives you toys and the other guy threatens to put you in a sack for being annoying. Parents actually told their kids a horned beast was coming to the house just to get them to behave, which seems like a lot of trauma just to ensure a quiet dinner. 12. Scandinavian farmers had to deal with a house gnome called the Tomt, who was incredibly high maintenance about his dinner order. The belief was that you had to leave him a bowl of porridge with a big pat of butter specifically on top, or he would throw a massive tantrum. There is a story where a farmer hid the butter at the bottom of the bowl, and the gnome got so mad he killed the family cow before realizing the butter was there all along. It is hilarious that a magical creature was outsmarted by a spoon and had the emotional stability of a tired toddler. 13. British farmers used to go out into their orchards on Christmas Eve to sing loud songs to the apple trees in a tradition called wassailing. They genuinely believed that if they did not serenade the wood and pour cider on the roots, the trees would get offended and refuse to grow fruit. Imagine a group of grown men shouting at a helpless tree in the middle of the dark, begging it to do its job for next season. It looks like the weirdest concert in history, but they really thought the vegetation had an ego that needed to be stroked with a wild party. 14. In medieval times, people thought they could predict the weather for the entire year just by using an onion on Christmas Eve. The trick involved taking 12 layers of an onion, sprinkling them with salt, and naming each one after a month of the year. They would leave them out overnight and check the next morning to see which ones were wet or dry to predict rainfall. It is honestly impressive that they trusted a vegetable to do the job of a meteorologist. Imagine planning your harvest based on how soggy a piece of onion looked on the kitchen table. 15. If you think your laundry pile is annoying, just be glad you did not live in old Europe where washing clothes during Christmas was considered dangerous. There was a weird superstition that if you hung wet laundry on the line during the 12 days of Christmas, you would cause a death in the family. Some people believed the empty clothes on the line looked like shrouds for the dead and would attract bad spirits. So everyone just walked around in dirty shirts for 2 weeks because they were terrified that doing a wash cycle would kill Grandpa. 16. In some Slavic cultures, people believed that the dinner table had to be set with an even number of place settings, or things would go terribly wrong. If an odd number of guests showed up, they would frantically add a plate for a ghost just to balance the numbers. The belief was that odd numbers invited bad luck or death, so they would rather set a place for an invisible spirit than risk it. It must have been super awkward trying to make conversation while everyone ignored the empty chair that was strictly there for safety reasons. 17. Long before online dating, Finnish traditions suggested that a girl could see her future husband on Christmas Eve by looking into a mirror. But the catch was she had to do it completely naked and holding a candle in a dark room. The idea was that the face of her future spouse would appear in the glass behind her shoulder. It sounds less like a romantic prediction and more like the perfect setup for a horror movie jump scare. You have to be really desperate for a date to stand alone in the dark, hoping a stranger appears in the reflection. 18. There is a bizarre old belief from the Middle Ages that bread baked on Christmas Day would never go moldy, no matter how long you kept it. People were so convinced of this that they would keep a loaf of Christmas bread for the entire year, sometimes crumbling it into medicine for the sick. They basically thought this bread had magical preservatives blessed by the holiday spirit. It is pretty gross to imagine someone eating year-old crumbs to cure a fever, but they genuinely thought it was a holy antibiotic. 19. In Norway, people are weirdly paranoid about their cleaning supplies on Christmas Eve thanks to an old legend about witches. The belief is that evil spirits and witches come out on this holy night specifically to steal brooms so they can ride them across the sky. So instead of relaxing by the fire, families spend the evening frantically hiding their mops and brooms in the deepest, darkest closets they can find. It is basically a nationwide lockdown for janitorial equipment because nobody wants to wake up and find out their cleaning lady's tools were used for a joyride. 20. If you are afraid of bugs, you would have hated Christmas in Eastern Europe because they actually wanted spiders on their trees. There is an old legend that finding a spider or a web on the Christmas tree was a sign of incredible good luck and prosperity for the next year. This is actually where we got the idea for tinsel because the artificial silver strands were meant to look like shiny spider webs. So while we scream if we see an 8-legged freak on the ornament box, these guys were practically hoping for an infestation to pay the bills. 21. British people took their dessert preparation so seriously that stirring the Christmas pudding was treated like a bomb disposal operation. The superstition stated that the pudding had to be stirred from east to west to honor the journey of the 3 wise men. If some clueless family member accidentally stirred it from west to east, they believed it would bring massive bad luck and practically ruin the dessert. Imagine screaming at your grandma in the kitchen just because she moved the spoon in a counterclockwise circle and doomed the whole family. 22. In Scotland, the first person to walk through your door on New Year or late Christmas season determined your entire fate for the year. This tradition called first footing said that you needed a dark-haired man to enter first to ensure good luck. If a blonde or a redhead walked in, it was considered a disaster that would bring misfortune to the house. It is hilarious to think that people would literally lock their doors and stare through the window inspecting the hair color of their friends before deciding if they were allowed to come inside and party. 23. You might love a hot shower, but in some old European traditions, taking a bath on Christmas Day was widely considered a terrible idea. The superstition claimed that bathing on this specific holy day would wash away your good luck and leave you vulnerable to evil spirits for the entire year. It is basically the dream scenario for every dirty kid who hates bath time because they could look their parents in the eye and say they were staying filthy for religious protection. Everyone must have smelled absolutely terrible by the time New Year arrived. 24. In parts of France and elsewhere in Europe, people used to voluntarily give up their comfy beds on Christmas Eve to sleep on the hard floor. The belief was that the Virgin Mary and the angels might stop by the house for a rest, so the humans had to clear out to make space. It is a nice gesture of hospitality, but imagine waking up on the cold wood with massive back pain while the perfectly good mattress stays empty, just in case a spirit needs a nap. It is the only time in history people made themselves homeless inside their own house. 25. Polish and Lithuanian families turned their holiday dinner table into a high-stakes game of roulette using pieces of hay. They would place straw under the tablecloth and each person had to pull out a stalk without looking to predict their future. If you pulled a green one, it meant a wedding, but if you pulled a yellow or withered one, it meant you would stay single and lonely. It is pretty harsh to let a piece of dried grass determine your romantic confidence in front of your entire extended family while you are trying to eat soup. 26. People in the Middle Ages believed that bees were surprisingly religious and would join in on the Christmas choir. The legend claimed that at exactly midnight on Christmas Eve, the bees in the hive would wake up and hum the 100th psalm in honor of the holiday. Beekeepers would actually go out to the hives and listen intently, trying to hear the insects singing a specific church song. It is a funny image to imagine a guy standing in the freezing cold with his ear pressed against a box of insects waiting for a musical number. 27. In parts of Eastern Europe, specifically Slovakia and Ukraine, fathers used to ruin the ceiling paint in the name of agriculture. At the start of Christmas dinner, the head of the family would take a spoonful of a traditional pudding called laksa and fling it as hard as he could at the ceiling. The belief was that the more food that stuck to the plaster, the better the crops would be next year. Imagine trying to enjoy a nice festive meal, while dad is launching sticky goo above your head to check if the harvest is going to be good. 28. Single women in the past were apparently desperate enough to take dating advice from a dead stick. There is a tradition involving St. Barbara's branch where a girl would cut a small twig from a cherry tree and put it in a vase of water in early December. If the stick bloomed with flowers by Christmas Day, it meant she was guaranteed to get married that year. It basically turned a piece of wood into a primitive version of a dating app, where you just stared at a twig for weeks hoping it would swipe right on your future. 29. Medieval England had a chaotic tradition where they appointed a Lord of Misrule to run the show during the holidays. This was usually a peasant or a low-ranking servant who was given absolute power to command the rich owners and nobles for the day. The belief was that flipping the social order upside down brought luck, but it was mostly just an excuse for the staff to make their bosses do ridiculous things. It sounds like the ultimate corporate nightmare, where the intern gets to fire the CEO just for laughs. 30. In rural Germany, there was a strange belief that roosters laid a magical egg on Christmas night, which was essentially a biological impossibility. This small egg was thought to have immense power, but it was also considered dangerous because it could hatch into a monster like a basilisk. So the farmers spent their holiday nervously watching the chicken coop to see if the male birds were laying eggs. It is wild that people were more worried about a confused rooster laying a cursed egg and hatching a dragon than they were about cooking dinner. 31. In the town of Dewsbury in England, there is a legend that the devil actually dies on Christmas Eve, but you have to make sure he stays dead. For centuries, the local church has rung its bell exactly one time, for every single year since Christ was born, known as the Devil's Knell. The belief is that if they finish the ringing correctly, the devil cannot harm anyone in the village for the next year. That is a massive amount of pressure on the guy pulling the rope, because if he loses count, he essentially invites Satan over for tea. 32. We are told to keep our shoes off the table for hygiene, but in England it was a serious supernatural rule. The superstition stated that placing new shoes on a table on Christmas Day was an incredibly bad omen that invited death into the family. It stems from the fact that in the old days, new shoes were often put on a corpse, so seeing them on the dinner table freakishly reminded people of a funeral. So if you got new sneakers as a gift, you had to keep them on the dirty floor unless you wanted to ruin the entire holiday vibe. 33. If you hate doing laundry, you would have loved the specific rules regarding spinning wheels on St. Thomas's Day. In many parts of England, it was believed that if you did any spinning or turning of a wheel during the Christmas season, the devil would come and personally tangle your yarn. It sounds scary, but it was actually just a brilliant excuse invented by exhausted women who wanted a guaranteed holiday break. They basically created a supernatural labor law that said, "If you make me work today, a demon will ruin the fabric, so I might as well sit on the couch." 34. In ancient Poland, having a cold might have been the luckiest thing to happen to you on Christmas Eve. There was a specific superstition that if you sneezed during the Christmas meal, it was a guaranteed sign that you would live to see another year. If you sat there quietly without sneezing, it was seen as a bad omen, suggesting sickness or death. It created a ridiculous dinner dynamic where everyone was desperately trying to tickle their own nose or inhale pepper just to prove they were going to survive. 35. We associate Christmas with happy songs, but in the Victorian era, people believed it was the absolute best time to tell terrifying ghost stories. Before television, families would sit around the fire and try to scare each other to death with tales of spirits and murders, which is why A Christmas Carol features ghosts. They genuinely thought the barrier between the living and the dead was thinner on Christmas Eve. It is a bold choice to celebrate a holiday of peace and joy by giving your children nightmares for 3 weeks straight. 36. Young women in the past had a very strange way of predicting their future husband involving farm animals and zero technology. The tradition was to run up to a pigsty on Christmas Eve and kick the fence violently to wake up the pigs. If an old pig grunted first, it meant she would marry an old man, but if a young pig squealed, she would find a young husband. It is hilarious that they trusted the sleepy grunts of a confused hog to make major life decisions about their romantic future. 37. School kids today just wait for the bell to ring, but in the 17th century, students engaged in a rebellious tradition called barring out. The students would literally lock the teacher out of the school building and refuse to let him back in until he signed a document granting them a vacation. They would pile desks and chairs against the door and negotiate through the window like tiny union leaders. It was a time when getting a few days off required a full-scale siege operation against the faculty. 38. In the Scottish Highlands, people believed in a midnight miracle that turned everyone into sprinters. The legend said that the very first bucket of water drawn from the well on Christmas morning would magically turn into wine or bring incredible luck. This led to grown men racing each other to the village well in the freezing dark just to be the first one to dip their bucket. Imagine the disappointment when you win the race and take a sip only to realize it is still just cold water and not a free Merlot. 39. We usually take down decorations when we get tired of them, but in the past leaving them up too long was considered a goblin hazard. The belief was that every branch of holly or ivy left in the house after Candlemas would turn into a mischievous goblin or sprite. These little guys would then infest your house and break your dishes until you cleaned up. It was basically a scare tactic to stop people from being lazy and leaving their dry Christmas tree in the living room until March. 40. Before we had weather apps on our phones, farmers used a greasy leftover bone to predict the winter forecast. The tradition involved analyzing the breastbone of the goose eaten at Christmas dinner. If the bone was white, it meant lots of snow was coming, but if it was dark or spotted, it meant a mild winter. It is hilarious to think that entire agricultural plans were based on the color of a skeleton from the dinner plate. They basically treated a piece of poultry garbage like a high-tech meteorological station. 41. Fire safety in the old days was less about smoke detectors and more about hoarding dust under the bed. People believed that the ashes from the Yule log had magical protective powers against lightning strikes and house fires. So instead of sweeping them up, they would collect the cold ashes and store them under their own beds for the entire year. It sounds completely backward to keep the remains of a fire directly under your mattress to prevent your house from burning down, but that was their logic. 42. Sitting comfortably at the Christmas table was practically illegal, according to some old European superstitions. The belief stated that if you crossed your legs while eating Christmas dinner, you would cause massive bad luck or prevent the family cows from giving birth in the spring. It turns a relaxing holiday meal into a test of physical endurance where everyone has to sit perfectly straight like they are in a military boot camp. You can bet nobody wanted to be the guy who accidentally crossed his ankles and doomed the farm. 43. We think of mistletoe as a free pass for romance, but originally it came with strict inventory limits. The traditional rule was that for every kiss stolen under the mistletoe, the man had to pick exactly one berry off the branch. Once all the berries were gone, the plant lost its magic and kissing was strictly forbidden. It turned a romantic moment into a resource management game where you had to count the berries before deciding if you could afford to make a move. 44. If your neighbor asked to borrow some salt on Christmas Day, you were supposed to slam the door in their face. The superstition claimed that lending anything, especially salt or bread, on this specific day meant you were giving away your own luck for the coming year. It created a really awkward social situation where being generous was seen as a self-destructive act. So if you ran out of seasoning during the feast, you were basically out of luck because nobody was going to risk their fortune just to help your bland potatoes. History clearly shows one thing: Christmas used to run on superstition, panic, and pure chaos. Now tell me this, if you had to bring back one of these insane beliefs today, which one would you force the whole world to follow? I want the wildest answers. If you enjoyed this madness, hit like, subscribe, and let's keep tearing open the strangest corners of history together.